Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
And I'm Rich Gear here with you as well. And I tell you, Doug, I'm kind of interested in this topic you want to talk. We're going to talk about the Greatest Showman. Well, more than that, but we're going to talk about freaks and kind of weird stuff. And what does that got to do with creation, Doug?
Well,
what was the title of the show?
The title is The Greatest Showman. We're going to review the movie that came out about P.T. Barnum.
And just recently, I just saw, my daughter loves the movie, and I saw it, and I have to admit, it really was a good film.
It was a
Hugh Jackman did a tremendous job on it, and it was kind of a throwback to the old-fashioned kind of a musical, but had contemporary kind. I mean, it's an old-fashioned time. You're dealing with 1840s to 1860s, but it has really kind of modern kind of music. But it really worked pretty well, I thought.
Yeah, I thought it was an excellent movie, and it portrayed P.T. Barnum in a fairly positive light.
Yeah,
and that surprised me because, especially with some of the things I know about him and what Jerry Bergman's research. I don't think he's actually published his research on P.T. Barnum and his
I don't know this. You have to. Well, let's inform our audience about it. Since you're up to speed on that, I'm not quite up to speed on that. I didn't know much about P.T. Barnum. The only thing I really knew about him was the supposed saying he used to say, "There's a sucker born every minute." I thought that was attributed to P.T. Barnum.
But apparently that's not his. Yeah. That was not his line. But.
Yeah, and it's about the only. And I knew he had a show, and I know there was Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey. I'm assuming that segued into Barnum's freak show. I thought Barnum was just a circus guy,
right.
But it turned out he was a whole different thing. He really popularized what we know as the modern freak show, and in the early 1840s, and so that's kind of an interesting thing, Doug. Because when I was reading this article, you let me look at the history of how this started to happen. I think is kind of interesting. So where do you want to start? You want to start with the movie? You want to start with the history?
Let's look at the movie first of all, because what the movie portrayed him doing with those people that were called freaks. Mm-hmm. It shows that Barnum actually paid them very well, and and actually gave them a outlet for them to earn a living, whereas before they were sort of squirreled away into their own little.
Well, this was the age before welfare. I mean, we didn't have really social programs and families that were embarrassed. I mean, the worst case scenario, Doug, was probably they would let them out before they got of age. They'd probably drown them in a river or something. But at best, they would hide them out, and they wouldn't put them in front of people. There's there are exceptions, of course, but when he came along, there are some other people before that did some things with it, but I don't know how well they treated these people or not. But and a lot of these people, it turns out in today's of modern medicine, we know what causes there was a movie, I saw it. It's called Freaks by Todd Browning. Same guy made the original Dracula with Bela Lugosi back in 1930. And Freaks came out, I think, 32, something like that. And it horrified audience because he used real freaks. There was an armless and legless man.
Oh, yeah.
And he looked like a human sausage, And then there was a story, of course. It was interesting. There was the dwarfs, the small, the man and the woman, they're really small, but it horrified. I mean, I heard about this movie for years, but it had been really not allowed to be seen for like 50 years. Well, maybe 30 years, 30, 40. I think it was, I read in the article said it was shown at the Cannes Film Festival in 1962, so that would have been 30 years. But I never saw it until, I would say, probably 10 years ago.
Yeah. Maybe
15, and it was on television. I saw it, I go, wow, this is an amazing movie, But, Doug, your point about it is, and I think this is true, and you're always going to find the exploiters, the people that took these people and treated them very badly. They probably did exist, but Barnum was not one of these people. And some of the other ones weren't that bad either. There was one in England I was reading about too, and he's the one that had John Merrick, I think. No, the Elephant Man, in the 1880s. So you hear both sides of things, but the fact of the matter is, what were these people going to do? They were going to be either sequestered in some hospital thing, observed under observation the rest of their life, or they could be out and have to be somewhat independent and make a living.
Right.
I mean, the Eng brothers,
The Chang and Eng bunker,
Yeah, bunker, yeah.
original Siamese twins, they were the ones that...
well, they were from Siam, modern-day Thailand, and yeah, they were conjoined twins, right?
Right.
Yep. So...
And it's interesting that, they actually were fairly wealthy at that time, and they fathered, between them, 21 children.
I still, that gets me, how do you, I'm sorry, how do you have a relation, but I guess the two brothers married two sisters.
Right, yeah.
And had 21 kids. I go, wow, how does that work? You gotta say there's no privacy in this deal. You know?
That's right, yeah.
Not much, really none. Okay? But they lived as much as can be lived, a productive and if not normal, at least a full life. You know what I mean? 21 kids. Wow, that's pretty amazing.
I guess the point I wanted to make with this had to do with how in many cases they were used as ways to promote evolution, and they ended up. I remember the story about Oda Benga, the pygmy that was displayed in the zoo at the St. Louis Exposition.
Right.
And also in New York City, they displayed him. This is around 1904 that this was occurring. And
what's interesting though, Doug, because he also was, after he'd get out of his cage, he'd ride around on the bus or the subways or whatever, dressed up like a man about town.
Right.
And he was pretty cosmopolitan in his tastes. And I mean, he'd come from Africa in a fairly uncivilized environment, but he came to America and became pretty. In fact, from what I understand, Doug, I read that he had become actually a Christian, but then later on he suffered from depression and ended up killing himself. And
I'm seeing this. I saw in the news just today about the actor that portrayed a little person in Mini Me.
Yes,
he just took his life.
Oh, he killed? I didn't know that that's what happened. And I knew he passed away. I heard that he passed away.
I remember the one Hervé Villechaize.
Yeah, he did too.
He passed away, took his own life.
Took his own life, yeah.
And so there is a problem with depression that occurs with people who have these deformities or these unusual features that end up questioning, why did God create me this way? And
well, here's a person who just died a while, but rejected God his whole life. He wasn't that way, but he was deformed, and that was Stephen Hawking.
That's right. Yeah.
He was crippled up and everything else, and I can't imagine that he didn't probably blame God for his misfortune in life, even though he had this genius IQ. He pretty much rejected God his entire life, which is unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, you say, well, it's easy for you to say, you're fairly normal. And I said, well, you haven't seen me up close and personal. No, I'm kidding. But anyway, you're right, Doug. It's a tough thing when you are the center of attention and not the most favorable light.
Right, yeah.
Yep.
And there are millions of people in that situation. Either you're too fat, you're too skinny, you're ugly, or you're
too tall, too short.
Yeah, and
so whatever.
It's and everyone, I think, has some sort of freakishness about them, and it's because of our fallen nature, Rich. It's we are a race of freaks in a lot of ways because we've had an accumulation of bad mutations that have taken place in our genome.
And we've talked about that over the years, that there seems to be, there are periods of stasis where things to be seen, but every generation carries a little bit more, even if it's neutral defects that don't really cause an outright damaging effect right up front. You have this what's called mutation or genetic load, which causes problems. And we've wondered about this for a long time. why, for instance, one that we were out in Arizona just recently, and we just went out there, and we mentioned Jack Quozo's book, and he talks about how the rates of maturity seem to be speeded up, as opposed to from the Roman Empire days, for instance, to really the late 1800s, puberty was about 16, 14, 16. And of course, they were getting married at 16, 18. So, because I learned about this when I was dealing with youth groups, and we were wondering why is there so many unwed pregnancies, or so many out of wedlock things, and why is it going? Well, I mean, our culture's so screwed up. We're getting puberty now at 9 years old, 9 and 10. We're not married till we're 30. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that picture? Well, that's a cultural thing. The later on married, but the fact is, you're not really mentally ready. But the body seems to be ratcheting down in a lot of respects. Now, some people think it might be the food in the thing. I'm not going to get into all that, but there seems to be periods where, and we look at the biblical record, we saw when lifespans began to decrease after the flood. We realize there's environmental, and Jerry Bergman, again, we've talked about him many times. He talks about how environment triggers things that's already in the genetic code, but there's the code has been, how should we say, tinkered with, or it's defective now, as opposed to what it used to be like, and we're not getting renewed like we were in the garden. Okay.
And one of the things, I was at a lecture by Dr. Jean-Guy Dagnol. He's a chiropractor that my wife works for.
Yeah.
And he was talking about how genetically modified GMOs.
GMOs, yeah. See, now Dan Jansen would argue with it.
Yeah,
he doesn't think there's anything wrong with them at all.
Well, I'm wondering about that. I'm trying to figure that out, whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. But
I think it depends probably what it is. Don't you think?
Yeah.
I mean, in some respects, Doug, if you breed two things to be a healthier or do something specific, that's genetically modified.
Right, yeah.
But I think most people with GMOs, they're thinking they've injected something into it to make a mutation happen or something, as opposed to just crossbreeding and things like that. But they're both genetically modified.
Right,
when you do that, when you go back to, for instance, we talked about Darwin's rock finches.
Right, yeah.
When they're left to their own devices, they kind of go back to their own normal. But in the environment they were in, they basically, the ones that were, the short-beaked ones, the long-beaked one, I can't remember what it is, they were the survivors, the ones on the Galapagos. But the point of it is the environment allowed certain ones to, there's two things that happen. The ones that don't make it, they just get killed off anyway. But Jerry also talked about environment can actually turn on or turn off triggers that are already programmed in your body.
Called the epigenetics.
Yes, that's what's really cool.
Which, there was just like methylation groups on the genome that either they're present or absent.
Right.
They turn on or turn off the functionality of a certain organism.
So the thing about it is, interesting, the history of the freak show, I was reading about that, Doug, and P.T. Barnum was I didn't realize he was really about a freak show to start with. Mm-hmm. It really wasn't a circus. It was a freak show. It was very popular. His time was like 1840 to 1860 or something like that. I think he retired in 1865. Tom Thumb, which is his big attraction, was like 25 inches high. He stopped growing after the age of I don't know, when he got to be 20 or 25 inches, he stopped growing. And in the movie, it was interesting because he comes up there and he was in his own room, and Barnum comes in there and says, "No, I want to help you. I think you can be a main attraction. I'm not here to do this, to exploit you this way. I want to basically, you can do something."
Right, and
that changed his life.
Yeah, that's sort of gave me a different perspective on Barnum in that way.
Because we know about Barnum and the hoaxes, right, Doug?
Yeah.
I mean, and there's absolutely no doubt Barnum perpetrated some hoaxes. He did.
Yeah.
That was pretty much part of the carnival act, if you will. But
remember we did a show about the Cardiff Giant.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
That was something that P.T. Barnum picked up on, and there was a guy who went out and he actually had a statue built, and then had it buried, Then a few years later, he had some workers dig it up, and then it became a big attraction. And they were thinking, well, there was giants in those earths in those days, you know.
I know.
And they were, it was actually something that an atheist had put out to try to destroy Christianity, because he was trying to show the Bible to be. That these guys were just fakers, you know.
Oh, yeah. See, that's the other thing, Doug, you and I, we've dealt with this with many issues. The Paluxy River tracks, for instance, the Cardiff Giant. The Paluxys we don't consider a hoax, but there were carvings. There were, and I don't know if these people were they might have been trying to perpetrate a hoax by carving tracks, but they were becoming very popular, so they were selling carved tracks. But the reality is, and we've talked about this as well, it's very easy to distinguish between a carved track and one that's been fossilized by compression of mud. But that aside,
especially if you dig it out underneath the.
Yeah, we had the what were in Michigan, the Michigan relics, and and there are people today. We had a guy we used to tape our show at the local public access place. He was convinced that they were real, and although the archaeologists think it's all bogus, I'm sitting there going, I don't know if they're all I don't know enough about it, but there are a lot of them that are fakes. There's no doubt about it. They were carved with modern tools. You can see it. Some of the stuff is kind of, well, how did they know that? Or I don't, But it's one of those things where I think, Doug, my own theory is that in the 1800s, as people with middle class culture, they got more time and leisure, and they didn't have radio, TV yet. Let's figure out a way to do something fun, and maybe pull somebody's leg on.
Well, like the 1930s was typical of that, and nobody else had a job, and so they had to figure out some way to make some money. And
you do those kinds of things, and so but Barnum, on the other hand, he would use real, like there was these people, they call them pinheads. And that was in that movie Freaks that I mentioned earlier. And they actually head comes to a point. And microencephaly. And of course in the 1840s, they didn't know about these things.
Right, yeah. And so it was...
they knew about them, but they didn't know what caused it.
It was scary, and they didn't know why this all occurred. And so we need to answer this as a question. Why is there people who are born this way with these deformities or problems, and that's a good question.
But Doug, for a theological answer, we know from a biblical perspective the world has fallen, and that there's corruption. But you would say to me, well, why does God pick them to have bad things happen and not these persons? And I said, well, I'm not. To our way of thinking, it's bad. There was a young man I knew. He was a son of a neighbor of mine, and he had what's called happy puppet syndrome. You ever heard of it?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, what it is, the guy walks around kind of like a marionette almost. He's on the balls of his feet, and he kind of has his hands like this all the time. But he's always happy. The kid was always happy. And I go, and he was worried because he was a Christian man. He said, Rich, could my son ever become a Christian because he can't accept Christ? How could he be born again if he can't receive Christ in his life? I says, he may already have received Christ. You have no way of understanding that right now. But I have a theory. This is my own take on it. The Lord God of the universe, who is gracious and favorable among all things and who is good, will not let a little one escape. And even if the hard drive, which is your brain, is damaged, your soul is not.
Right, yeah.
Your soul is not damaged. And that's the thing. We, in the United States, even as Christians, we are so short-sighted because all we understand is this physical life. If that's okay, even as Christians, we lose sight of the fact that we got money in the bank, got a nice house. I'm sorry, it's all temporary.
Yeah.
It's all temporary. This is going to fade away. Even if the Lord does not come back in my lifetime, I'm going to die.
Well, this is just a split second in comparison to the vastness of the...
And of course, that doesn't minimize the fact, Doug, that it's hard because this is all we really know. We take the other on faith, and as we can read Scripture, we can have understanding, and we see the good things about it. We can look and see that God has pulled his hand back a little bit on this life. That's why death happens. But not entirely. That's why we can have, Doug, you and I can we have the Arizona trip and have your brother shows up and there's answers to prayers and food tastes good. Even in a fallen world, we can eat stuff. Yes, a lot of food's based on death.
Right.
You know, if you eat meat, you're eating something that died. Okay? And, even plants don't die in a biblical sense, but in a biological sense, they die too. You know what I mean? They can't reproduce anymore. So we were designed to eat. But the thing about it is, God is telling us this is temporary. Don't get your sights fixed on this life. When you're 19, 15, 22, even and you're in the midst of your life, and it's hard not to do that.
Right. Yeah.
You say it might be easier for me. I'm a little bit older. I'm not the new kid on the block anymore. Doug and I are not. We were finding that out because my knee was all messed up last week. I go, boy, it kind of stinks getting older. You know what I mean? As your father-in-law used to say, old age is not for sissies.
Right, yeah.
Boy, I tell you, I fell last week. But I learned God is good and he is gracious. But it doesn't mean everything in this life is good.
Right, yeah.
But it will work to good if we let it. And even the pinheads, even the guy with no arms and no legs. And it was interesting that people like P.T. Barnum, I don't know whether he even had a faith, whether he was just a huckster, or a showman, whatever. But all I know is there was a certain thing about him because he paid his people pretty well. You mentioned earlier. I mean, that to me is amazing.
Not only that, he opposed slavery, and he also had some Christian principles behind
He
it.
must have, yeah.
I think he later joined a Universalist church.
Did he really?
Yeah.
I don't know about that, but anyway. He's a very interesting character. I really didn't know anything about him. And of course, when you see a movie like, it's a musical, okay? The Greatest Showman with Hugh Jackman. I mean, and then what's the Zendaya or so? What's the gal, the black gal, she's a singer? Oh, she was amazing. And some other people in the show were really good. And there was one artificial construct. The guy, I guess the guy he went to partner with, apparently that's not historically right. But a lot of stuff in there, I found, he brought Jenny Lind, the opera singer, over here. Yeah. That's all real. I don't know, but you don't know how much it is. So you got to research it yourself. But the idea of freaks in the world is, I think you put it very, very well, Doug. We are all freaks. We are genetically all mutated. We are all not where we're supposed to be in the garden. We've all fallen. We have the death gene in us now. We are not where we were supposed to be, and we're not what we should supposed to be yet.
And when you look at each of us, because there is that missing piece of us that isn't working properly, and there is death on the horizon. We are really all in the same boat, and we need to treat each other in the same way. If a person has a deformity or a fault or a problem, it is, since we are all in the same boat, we need to lift each other up and to positively respond to each other and to treat each other with respect. And that was one of the things I saw in the movie that P.T. Barnum tried to mitigate, was that the snobbishness of the New York City culture.
Oh yeah,
was pretty. It was ugly.
Pretty ugly.
And it showed that how they looked down on these people, and that they didn't want to have anything to do with them. But it turned out that the circus became a family for these people.
Yeah.
And it gave them a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning.
They unified together. Especially it was tough because when it burned down, I think in 1860.
Right.
I think Barnum kind of. I don't think he ever did anything after that. I think he stopped. You know?
Well, in the movie, it showed that he started his tent circus.
Yeah, maybe that's when that happened. Yeah, the freak show was done.
Yeah.
Although we all know circuses always had sideshows and freak shows.
Mm-hmm.
I remember seeing them when I was a kid. But it was interesting. This article, Doug, that we were looking at talked about how the freak show at the turn of the century began to go into decline as medical understanding happened of how this stuff was going on, and basically we got a lot less voyeuristic or thought that was not the best thing to do. But I remember the Merrick guy, you know, the film that came out in 1980, The Elephant Man, and when he said, "I'm not an animal, I'm a human being," and boy, it breaks your heart. But it is shocking to see people that are, I mean, people joined it like Siamese twins, or people with microencephaly, or people, we even today tend to shy away, and if not shun them, we kind of pretend they're not around. And I think P.T. Barnum put it right out in your face. These people are people.
They are,
and they can do things. Yeah.
That's a interesting thing about those type of people. The disabilities are. Let's talk about disabilities.
All right, we got a couple minutes left, so where do you want to go?
Well, you know, there's a lot of things that all of us experience eventually. Is that if as we age, we decline in our functionality.
We can't do what we did when we were 20 when we're 90.
That's right, yeah.
If we even make it that far.
And we have to understand that, you know, people with disabilities are still people inside. That soul within inside them still has that value. And I think there is a tendency for us to shy away from the nursing homes and the old people. We put them in their little boxes to wait to die.
Yeah.
And you know, that's I see that as a problem. And I see that you know, the people who are in their 90s or hundreds or whatever, they still have a value, and they have a wisdom about them. Well,
they're being made in the image of God.
Right.
That's our starting point as believers, as creationists, as people who follow the rule of God. And because to me, Doug, the operative line is you cannot get good without God. Mm-hmm. God is how we define good. You cannot get it otherwise. And I think as we become more and more secular, Doug, we lose the good. And that's what Darwinian thinking does, unfortunately. It removes the good ultimately, unless you have some kind of we always have this little conscience in us.
Right.
And it gets, so let's do something, but so often we're relegated to basically the back burner. And that's what we have to do. That's what we have to realize. That's not good.
We'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.